Steve Corneli. Steve is an independent consultant on clean electricity business and regulatory issues associated with deep decarbonization of the power sector. From 2001 to 2016, he worked for NRG Energy in a variety of roles, including wholesale market development, government and regulatory affairs, market and climate policy, and clean energy development. And Steve's going to talk to us today about his paper, the title of which is A PRISM-Based Configuration Market for Rapid, Low-Cost, and Reliable Electricity Sector Decarbonization. So Steve's going to talk for about 25 minutes, and then we're going to have a Q&A session. And I just want to remind you, you can put questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand at that time. And we are going to call on people to ask their own questions, just so we get some active participation here. So I guess now I'm going to invite Steve to share his slides and begin his talk. Thanks.
The title of this, PRISM-Based Configuration Market, the PRISM thing is an acronym for Precise Renewable Integrating System Models. And that means mixed integer programming models that are plugged into a very relatively detailed model of the entire, at least an entire electrical interconnection, and that have the kind of granular data on wind and solar availability across many hours and across very small patches of the geography that Karen was talking about. So that PRISM is just shorter to say than that. And the key thing, other key thing in this is these are not just, this is not like let's design an efficient electricity market, forever. This is about designing an efficient way to have very rapid, low cost and reliable decarbonization of the power sector. If it weren't for that, maybe I'd be proposing something completely different, but my view is that's more important than anything else in the electricity sector. So we need to figure out how to do it. Now I have to see if I can move these. There we go. So why use one of these PRISM models in a market? Well, the answer to that has to do with the nature of the electric grid. And I think we all know that the Eastern interconnection or any other very large electrical interconnection is actually a machine, and actually are probably amongst the largest machines ever built. They're machines because all the parts have to operate together just right in a synchronized, coordinated manner, or it breaks down. The most important thing, I think, from a market design perspective, and especially a clean energy one, is the need for the injections of electricity in every moment to exactly equal the amount that's being used or withdrawn by the grid across the whole thing. If that doesn't happen, it falls apart. There's cascading blackouts, there's huge damage to electric generators, there's load shedding, and the whole system is designed to completely avoid that kind of thing in all events. So, and it largely depends on whether you have the right mix and amount of resources. Now, this has been really easy to do with firm resources, including most fossil resources. So when we say electricity markets were designed with the old resources in mind, this is what they were designed with. Firm resources are resources that are available in every hour. That means they can substitute for each other in any hour. And that makes it really easy to get the right amount and the best mix. And I think we all have seen and probably played around with planning curves of it. They're very simple. The input is you put in peaking, intermediate, and baseload fixed and variable costs to get the envelope of the cost envelope across all hours. Then you put in the ordered expected load in every hour, ranked from highest to the lowest, to get a load duration curve. And the output just falls right out. It's the optimal amount in megawatts of peak load, intermediate, and basing resources. You can't go wrong. And this isn't just used in central planning. When I worked in a competitive power company developing and doing M&A work for years, and we use this kind of thinking all the time to figure out when to build a new baseload plant or when to buy a gas plant and get rid of baseload plants. So this is very common in use in both competitive and regulated environments, or was. Now, unfortunately, as several people have said, renewables and storage are not like that. They're not firm. They're not available in every hour. You look here at these graphs show crosswise, they show the hours in every day, and vertically they show the days in the year. We have a wind project, a solar project, and another solar project that's located hundreds of miles north of the other solar project, all lined up here. And if we look through, we can find all these times when blue means there's no energy and red means there's lots of energy coming out. So we can find these times when there's not very much, there's no wind energy and there's not very much solar energy. And if we look carefully, it takes a while, but we can find a whole bunch of those. And that's just with 3 sites. If you want to put together a portfolio that will meet the balancing constraint, you need to do this with hundreds of sites or thousands of sites. And what you find is only certain combinations can help balance load. And even the best combinations need specific other kinds of clean resources that are available in the gaps to fill in. And this means that all these clean energy resources are complements. They're not substitutes like firm resources. You can't swap them across hours. You need to have exactly the right mix in every hour. And that's very hard to find. And when you find them, it's very hard to get them developed because they might be anywhere. So probably the best way to do this is with one of these PRISM models. Now here's a modeling exercise that came out from E3 using the Resolve model and EFI just last month for decarbonizing New England. And the bottom here shows the optimal mix of resources in every week. And you can, the blue resources are wind, the yellow are solar, the grayish green are nuclear and hydro, and then the gray ones, the dark gray ones at the top are what you use when there's not enough of the other ones. And if we look at some hours and days, we can see that there's entire periods in the winter, like 5-day periods, when there's not enough wind or solar to meet load and avoid load shedding. And so instead you have to use what this study finds is the cheapest, which is zero carbon gas burned in gas turbine technologies. And you can see that if there weren't that, there'd be a lot of load shedding in not only this week, but in the week before it and the week after it. So to avoid that, you either need to use a cheap, clean, firm resource like the zero carbon gas, or you need to build a lot more renewables and have a lot more batteries so you could have time to put more energy to charge the batteries. And that ends up costing, in this case, $20 billion more in 2050 per year. So it can make a huge difference in the cost to get the arithmetic right. And the arithmetic is really complicated. So this need to find these unique complementary resources to decarbonize the power sector, in my view, creates 3 problems for market design to solve. And I think these add on to the things Paul talked about. One is very high information costs associated with using clean energy resources to meet balancing constraints. You need to analyze literally thousands of data points with billions of permutations, and that just can't be done without a big mixed integer or linear program to do the arithmetic. The second is challenging and really complex coordination costs across different technologies, locations, and project developers. Some of those things that are needed in hour A, B, or C, or 1, 2, or 3, are completely different technologies, hundreds or thousands of miles apart, and built or known by different companies. Now, how do you get them to coordinate on that decision? It's much, much harder than just saying, well, we got to get, enough peaking baseload and intermediate generation to have resource adequacy, and we'll let investors sort out what the most efficient mix is. These only work if they're done together by companies that don't have anything to do with each other, that are competing with each other, and done instead of something else. So that's really complicated. And finally, there's a much higher risk of failing to solve those first 2 problems. You get the prohibitively high cost of decarbonization that we see in the New England study. If we try to use all renewables and batteries, we get similar high costs if we don't preserve existing nuclear by making sure they have enough revenue in the market or outside of the market. You see that in some other evolved energy studies, like one in New Jersey. And if we don't get the decarbonization right, we have the huge risk of runaway climate change. So we got to get them right. Maybe we can get insights, I thought, into how to solve this problem of getting markets to find the the right mix of competitive inputs by looking at how competitive firms do it. So here's a good example of complementary inputs. You got to get the right mix here or the engine won't work. So how do they do that? Well, one thing they don't do is they don't use decentralized market optimization by changing the amount of inputs depending on, you know, their marginal contribution to the bottom line or the cost and the dual profit function. Even though that's how you do it with substitutes, that's not how you do it here. If lower piston prices don't make auto companies substitute more pistons for fewer engine blocks, you know, that doesn't happen and everybody understands that. So we need to think about that. They don't use central planning to solve that problem. They don't turn it over to the Central Soviet. They use central managerial optimization and contracts. This is what Ronald Coase taught us, you know, almost 100 years ago, to get what they need to compete and when they need it. So there's really key steps to this. They identify the complementary inputs they need to produce the output. They seek competitive offers for all those inputs. They identify the lowest cost combinations of inputs that can produce the output. Math may be needed here. And they contract with those input sellers to supply the needed amounts when they are needed. So this is like the competition for the market paradigm that Paul talked about. But it's done by almost every competitive manufacturer and many done by combinations of companies increasingly to optimize common logistic problems. This approach inspired my configuration approach, this, you know, idea. And as a question for you all to think about, we could talk about at the end, where do all power companies already participate in a process exactly like this? Anyway, going on to my market design that's intended to address those three big problems. The market is hosted regionally by an RTO, a joint state board under Section 209 of the Federal Power Act, or some other regional entity, kind of like the EIM is in the West. It has a new procurement round every 3 years. Clean resource developers are invited to submit sealed bids for new projects containing their amortized all-in project costs based on a technology-specific pro forma draft contract. The winners are selected by being put into the PRISM analysis tool, very much like in these incremental decarbonization studies today, but using real bid prices and performance capabilities. The PRISM tools have a GHG emission constraint that declines over time. So they select a resource mix that can meet that constraint, a resource mix that can balance generation and load every 5 minutes or every hour in some models. And it does those things at the lowest cost. Winning bidders are awarded financial swaps with load, kind of like, very much like tolling agreements in the merchant market, which in my experience have worked really well. Load pays the as-bid prices to projects. Projects must offer their output in the SCED market and they pay their SCED revenues to load. Penalties are deducted from the fixed cost payments if there's failure to perform as required and as expected for that resource. And the length of these swaps can vary with resource type. Some might need relatively short 5-year swaps, some might need 15 or 20. The goal is to ensure the development of whatever clean energy resources are needed for reliable low-cost decarbonization, without picking winners ahead of time or planning, while avoiding the massive information costs and regarding the contribution to system balancing. And my view is those costs will always favor fossil resources, even with a substantial cost and price on carbon, and to avoid expensive or unavailable financing due to growing revenue risk in SCED-based markets. And my guidance here is, you know, really Dan Reicher's work on this topic. So I'm glad to see Dan in the audience today. There's a number of critical details that I want to try to run over here at a high level. There's many more in the paper. The first is just the way this optimization works across time. I'm proposing we use stepwise myopia. In other words, we don't do a 30-year optimization. We just optimize each auction each year to avoid needing to put perfect foresight forecast to 2050 in each incremental market round. Existing resources and load would be represented in the PRISM data and optimization based on publicly available data, so they don't need to bid in. Winning resources are selected for the least cost impact on least cost system solution to carbon and balancing constraints. So what do they do to the whole system that allows it to meet the carbon and balancing constraints? Meanwhile, outside of the PRISM market, the same tools and data and models are used for specific forward-looking scenario analysis to address some key intertemporal challenges without requiring perfect foresight in the market clearing. Talk briefly about the way the carbon and balancing constraints work in the PRISM market, or intended to work. The balancing constraint requires the model to select resources that will be available in all of those dispatch intervals, instead of me having to go through and circle every bar with red and figure out whether to put batteries there. The linear program, or the MIP, does that really quickly. And it makes sure those resources get paid their fixed and variable costs. So that's like the dispatch. And the declining carbon constraint requires that dispatch to result in carbon emissions that stay within the declining carbon constraint. Current period, but without conflicting with future periods carbon constraints. The carbon constraint, I think, will be the forcing function for a lot of new resource additions. And I think the future period carbon constraints can be addressed in a variety of ways that don't require perfect foresight bets on what new future costs will be. We can talk about those later. The GHG budget declines annually. It's like a set target and timetable consistent with IPCC or other authoritative climate science needed to, everybody needs to do it to avoid some going over some acceptable threshold of warming. The budget is developed voluntarily by members or adopted in response to policy requirements. And the first one is really interesting to me because I see so many power companies adopting science-based emission reduction targets. They're all there in terms of getting to the goal. They're just looking for a good way to do it. Well, this would give them a good way to do it. And the actual emission reductions in the real world would result from the deployment of these resources that then would be dispatched in a way just based on economics that would displace fossil energy in the real-time market without an explicit carbon price on fuels. So it would work without a carbon price, very much like a CES would work. Resource adequacy. As everybody said so far, this is a big deal and changing dramatically. To me, resource adequacy means having the right mix of resources, including type and amount, to provide an acceptable frequency of load shedding events that would be needed if there's insufficient energy being produced to balance load. So the PRISM balancing constraint in this market looks at every dispatch interval and makes sure that condition is met. Peak load, low wind, and high demand and periods, all periods are looked at, and that's met in all of them by its selection. So that makes me think, as a conjecture, that the PRISM market could, or the PRISM tools could evolve to support new approaches to resource adequacy. It could identify the load shedding frequency expected from any overall supply portfolio, and it could identify the marginal contribution to load shedding frequency due to alternative subportfolios, sort of like an instantaneous marginal ELCC metric for anything that might be proposed or added. If so, if I'm right about that, a PRISM-based market should be able to be designed to provide a floor level of resource adequacy. You could pick it. We want 1 in 5 years, or 1 in 8 years, or 1 in 12 years. But it could be configured, the configuration market itself could be set up to produce this floor. And it could be set fairly conservatively low, so you get a fair amount of scarcity pricing in the markets while guaranteeing that there wouldn't be a runaway reliability problem. This would allow more demand, more scarcity pricing. Paul mentioned it would be good. We of course agree, and that would allow more demand side engagement in the market, a bunch of other resource allocation decisions, but the PRISM market would still be there to ensure that an efficient mix of capital intensive clean energy gets deployed and can get low cost financing. So when you're adding all these clean energy units, you're going to have some retire. And how does that work? Well, you'll keep adding clean ones. That oversupply will cause SCED market prices to fall unless a bunch of plants retire and restore prices temporarily. which would be good because we need a lot of resources to retire to make room for clean energy. But what we don't need is for things like existing nuclear and potentially a whole bunch of existing gas resources to retire to the extent they're going to be needed in the end state or near end state of decarbonization, as a lot of these studies suggest. So to address these kinds of resources can bid their going forward costs into the configuration market along with the new ones. And if the PRISM clearing mechanism says, hey, we need you, you keep making lower cost to balance and decarbonize, they would get contracts, swap contracts at their going forward costs or based on their going forward costs. Otherwise, they'd retire and be replaced by even better resources in the next auction. Some of these chicken and egg problems that keep coming up, like transmission. How would you get solar and wind projects in the best locations to bid if there's no transmission there? How would you get distributed energy resources to bid if there's not a good DERM system and a robust distribution infrastructure to support them? How would you get clean firm technologies to bid if nobody can actually get them off the lab bench because they need to be demoed and deployed at scale for 10 or 15 of them first. So these issues in my proposal would be addressed through using the same PRISM tools outside of the market to do forward-looking scenario analyses to find the sort of the best future solutions that are dependent on particular infrastructure or institutional arrangements, and then to set them up. So efficient transmission could be, that's found through scenario analysis, would be proposed through the RTEP. Efficient distribution system architecture would be explored and developed through state distribution system planning. Finding the right technologies to boost across the valley of death would be done through scenario analysis, and any kinds of technologies that look exciting for that would be invited to participate in a PRISM market set aside without competitive pressure. You could use the same thing to make sure that your carbon budget clearing rules don't conflict with future carbon budgets. So once these things are established or understood through scenario analysis, then the projects that would depend on them are invited to bid. Like, here's an approved transmission line to a place with great solar, so go ahead, we can invite solar projects to bid in that location.
2 minutes.
Finally, self-supply options. This has become, of course, a lot more interesting to a lot of us in terms of the current interest in the FRR in response to the MOPR. And that's helped think through some of these issues. So what I'm proposing is that LSEs, participating LSEs, whether they're participating because it's in the FERC tariff or they're participating because they signed up to join something like the EAM, they would have two different self-supply options. One is buy all, sell all, and the other I call virtual optimization. Under the buy all, sell all, that continue to participate in the configuration market, that get settlements for the procured side of the swap, the load side of the procured swaps, but that also bid their supply resource into the market. And if they receive payments for that, it would offset their settlement obligations. Under the virtual optimization approach, they'd propose a portfolio to the market operator and say, use your PRISM tools to analyze this and find out how good it is. And if the portfolio would actually lower, well, if the portfolio was not so good and would increase the total system cost, they could still use it in lieu of participating in the market, but they'd have to pay that increment in system costs so as not to inflict them on anybody else. And if the portfolio actually lowers costs compared to not being there, the LSE could elect to convert it to a buy all sell all and basically, pocket the savings themselves. So those are the key ideas I wanted to discuss here. There's a lot more in the paper. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for your thoughts and comments and criticism. And I'm looking forward to your questions.